Good morning, everyone. Welcome in. We'll get started shortly. We'll let everyone enter the webinar first. Okay, perfect. I think we can get started shortly. Thank you all for joining us today, for joining our webinar, DACA Where We Are Now. Please note that this webinar is being recorded. So today's webinar presentation is presented by attorneys from the Immigrant Legal Resource Center. With the current event on the latest DACA ruling, we hope to provide an overview of what this ruling means and hopefully give you an update on the current landscape and what potential impacts may occur. Thank you, Liz and Veronica, for presenting. I will go ahead and pass it over to you both.
Thanks, Cynthia. And hi, everybody. Thanks so much for being here with us today. There we go. My name is Liz Palupa. I am a senior policy attorney and strategist with the Immigrant Legal Resource Center. I am joined today by my colleague, Veronica Garcia, a staff attorney in our San Francisco office and our regional DACA expert. So very excited to be here with you all today. A little bit of introduction. As Cynthia said, we are going to attempt to sort of take you through some of the recent updates for DACA in the litigation and where we are now. We're going to try to do that without confusing anybody any further. If you're already confused, you're in good company. We're also going to try to look at some of the policy, the decision in terms of the other policy context and immigration law context. There's obviously been a lot of news over the last couple of months, so I'm going to highlight just some other policy considerations for DACA holders. And then Vera's going to take us through the considerations for both initial and renewal DACA applications, and also take us through some information about advanced parole. And we're going to do our best to leave time for Q&A at the end, but in the meantime, please use the Q&A box. We're going to do our best to answer questions as we go along, and again, also try to leave some some time at the end. So let's sort of get into it with the most recent updates for the DACA litigation. To take it back, just to provide a little bit of context. And again, if you are confused with where we are with DACA, you're in good company. There is a lot that has happened over the course of the last decade with DACA. But our story here is going to start in July of 2021. So as folks know, DACA existed initially as a 2012 DHS memorandum that was signed by the Department of Homeland Security Secretary under the Obama administration. And until 2022, that program existed solely by DHS memorandum. And one of the kind of persistent issues in DACA litigation has been whether or not the Obama administration was incorrect in creating the program via memorandum, as opposed to creating a regulation and going through a multi-step process to create a regulation through DACA. So in July of 2021, a suit that was brought by the state of Texas and several other states, a district court judge in Texas, Judge Hannon, found that the DACA 2012 memorandum was unlawful and that DACA as a program was unlawful. So while that case was appealed to the Fifth Circuit, the Biden administration, trying to get around this issue of memorandum versus regulation, attempted to, well, they didn't attempt to, they published a regulation about DACA, which essentially just sort of codified DACA as we know it with all the same eligibility requirements. And they published that in August of 2022 and was set to go into effect on October 31st, 2022, and was supposed to replace the 2012 memorandum. However, in October of 2022, the Fifth Circuit agreed with the Texas court that the DACA memorandum was unlawful, but they sent the case back to the Texas District Court to decide whether or not the DACA regulation was lawful. And while that was happening, the DACA regulation was put on hold. and it didn't go into effect. And then in September of 2023, the district court, again, the same district court, found that the DACA regulation was unlawful, and that decision was appealed to the Fifth Circuit once again. So just stick with me. All of this is going to be important, but this is a long and windy road, so we're going to try to be brief. So bringing us to now. In January 2025, the Fifth Circuit issued its decision in Texas v. the United States after it was appealed from the district court the second time. And the court found that DACA was unlawful, but they did state that the part of DACA that was unlawful was the work authorization part of DACA, and that the government did have the ability to give protection from deportation. That's the deferred action part of DACA, but didn't have the ability to provide a work permit in addition to that. The other surprising thing about this decision is that the Fifth Circuit declined to have the order apply everywhere and instead only had the order applied in Texas, because that was the only state that had showed that it would be harmed by DACA, or it had been harmed by DACA. So they said that, yes, we think this is unlawful. The government's allowed to stay somebody's deportation, but they're not allowed to give them a work permit on that basis. But only Texas showed that they're being harmed by this. The other states didn't, so this only applies in Texas. And importantly, that decision was stayed until March 11th. And March 11th was the deadline for the parties to request a review by the Fifth Circuit of that decision. This just get other judges to take a look at that decision and decide whether or not they agreed. So that brings us to March 11th, which seems like a long time ago, but it was not. So what happened? Neither party asked for a review of the case. So the order, or the mandate, as it's called, that was issued by the Fifth Circuit in January, went into effect. So kind of the takeaways from this order, and please keep in mind, we're still sort of sussing out what this means because of a lack of sort of guidance from any of the parties, but we will get to that in just a minute. So the mandate going into effect, what it did was it sent the case again back to the district court to decide how this decision would be implemented. So the Fifth Circuit said to the district court, okay, this is in your court now. You have to decide how you're going to implement a DACA program or you're going to order the DACA program be implemented as it regards Texas, according to this order. Theoretically, DACA is open now for initial applications and continues to be open for renewal applications because it's been open for renewal applications this whole time. However, again, theoretically, the work authorization is only available in the 49 states other than Texas, but deferred action is available everywhere. So if you're a DACA holder in a state other than Texas, then according to this order, you can still get your work permit. But again, to make things even more complicated, the decision for Texas has been stayed while these kinds of things get worked out. So DACA recipients can still access their EADs. Again, if you're confused, just wait. Okay, so where are we going from here? Another layer to this is that an appeal to the Supreme Court is still possible. So this is a bit of an interesting situation where we're waiting for a process, a decision, additional guidance from the district court in Texas on how to implement the Fifth Circuit's ruling. But we're also waiting to see if any of the parties are going to appeal to the Supreme Court. The states could appeal to the Supreme Court because they want the order issued for all of the states. They want it nationwide. The plaintiffs or the defendants, which include the government, could appeal to protect DACA or do something else. So the parties could still appeal. I believe they have until April 17th to decide if they want to appeal to the Supreme Court. And so litigators, I think, are talking about that and trying to make a decision. We should be expecting, and whether we get it or not is up in the air, we should be getting some guidance from USCIS or the White House or DHS, something recognizing the Fifth Circuit's decision and saying how how USCIS is going to handle DACA applications. Usually when we get a court order of this magnitude, USCIS will post a notice or some kind of guidance on their website about the different changes. And so far, the only notice we have, the most recent notice we have on the DACA website for USCIS is an order noting that renewals will continue to be processed and initials will be accepted but not processed. Remember, that's the status quo we've been in for several years now. And that was posted as a result of the January 17th, 2025 order. And remember, that was before the inauguration. So basically, since the inauguration, we haven't had any updates as far as what USCIS is planning to do with DACA applications. So again, if you are confused, me too. There's a lot of there has been a lot of litigation about DACA just for almost from the beginning, from 2012 on. There has been a lot of litigation about DACA. It has gone up to the Supreme Court and then they have started all over again. So long and winding litigation is really hard to follow, and it's hard for everybody to follow. Um, but we're also confused in this moment because, again, we are lacking any kind of guidance from the government. And usually we have something by now to say, well, we're not processing these, or this is what we think the court order means. We have nothing right now. So that's adding to the unknowns and the confusion. Another piece of this is that if folks remember this, folks who have been watching the DACA space for a while will remember this. Towards the end of the first Trump administration and the beginning of the Biden administration, there was a period of time where initial DACA applications were being accepted at USCIS as a result of other litigation. Um, so that thousands and thousands of people who were DACA eligible who had not been able to apply for DACA because of various court orders um, put their applications in to be considered. And those were being processed at USCIS until this current litigation stopped processing of those initial applications. And so the result of that is that there are thousands of initial DACA applications sort of stuck at USCIS that they've been fingerprinted. A lot of them have been looked at by adjudicators, and they're just sort of sitting, waiting for the ability to be pushed out as approvals or denials. Um, and we don't know what's going to happen with those applications. Again, we don't have any guidance on what's going to happen with those applications. And then there's just the sort of general landscape that we're in as far as anti-immigrant policies. I think if you're on this webinar, you've been paying attention to the news and you've seen a lot of the different things that have been happening. And it's important to think about DACA, especially if you're a DACA holder or a potential DACA holder, to be very mindful of the overall landscape and culture of this administration and what they're trying to do in terms of mass deportation and high immigration enforcement. So all of that is, if you are confused, you are in very good company. That's all very confusing. So I'm just going to hit a few of the sort of policies that we've seen that might affect DACA holders. This is not an exhaustive list by any means, but if you have questions about other things, please put them in the Q&A. And again, we're going to do our best to answer them. So first thing I want to talk about is something called registration. If folks have been paying attention, this is a relatively new development. On March 12th, I believe, the administration announced that they were going to be implementing a registration process for undocumented immigrants living in the United States for certain non-citizens. That was announced through what is called an interim final rule, which means it's a regulation and it's a final regulation, but it has a delayed effective date, and it doesn't have and it's not you don't get to comment on it and have them consider the comments. It doesn't go through the regular process for passing a regulation or for codifying a regulation. So an important thing, and if you take anything away about registration from this slide, the registration is not live yet. The form is available for online filing. The interim final rule has been posted. All of this information's out there, but it doesn't take effect until April 11th. So if you're thinking about this, if you're worried about whether or not you have to register, please keep in mind that you shouldn't do anything until April 11th because the rule is not in effect. The requirement is not live yet. So please don't make any moves until at least April 11th. And so what is registration? It requires that certain non-citizens register with the federal government within 30 days of entry and carry proof of their registration. So that covers a decent amount of people, but there's a lot of folks who are non-citizens who have already filed applications or already gone through processes that already consider them to be registered. So folks who would need to register under this statute are folks who entered without inspection and haven't had any contact with DHS, or folks who submitted an application to USCIS that didn't require fingerprinting or have the option to apply for a work permit attached to them, and also certain Canadian visitors fall under the statute. But the folks that don't have to register, again, this is not an exhaustive list, but it's lawful permanent residents and those who applied for lawful permanent residence, parolees, those with I-94s, folks in removal proceedings, and people with EADs are all considered registered. So again, before you make any moves regarding registration, please try to get a legal consultation to see what your individual situation is before you fill anything out online. I do want to note one more thing about registration. This is purely an enforcement tool. Um, there is no pathway to status attached to this. The administration has come out and said that the only reason they're doing this is to facilitate more removals from the country. So again, there is no pathway to a green card. There is no work permit that comes with this. This is simply a tool for enforcement. This is distinct from a process called registry, which is a different part of the law, which does provide a pathway to citizenship. So very different pieces of the law. And again, registration, what was announced on March 12th, what goes into effect on April 11th, is not registry. It does not come with any kind of benefit like a workup permit or deferred action or pathway to permanent status. Another note here is that litigation on this is very likely. So maybe that's another good reason to sort of hold off before the regulation goes into effect on April 11th. I know a lot of folks have questions about travel and is it safe to travel if you're a DACA holder, and even if you're not a DACA holder, I think folks have questions about travel. And again, our recommendation is always, always, always try to get a consult, a screening, speak to an attorney if you have one before you travel. Advanced parole is still available as far as we know. You can still apply for advanced parole. You can still travel if you've had advanced parole granted. You do need to move with caution. We have heard various stories. Some people are traveling in advanced parole with no issues, leaving and coming back, no issues. Other folks are reporting having some difficulties, secondary screening, et cetera, when trying to come back into the country. So just be very cautious when you're deciding to travel. Another piece that folks probably want to pay attention to are upcoming countrywide travel bans. I don't know if anybody has seen that in the news, that there are, we're looking at potentially seeing some countrywide travel bans similar to the Muslim ban from the first Trump administration. There's a list of 43 countries previewing the countries that we think will be part of those bans. Again, we're working off media reports. We don't have anything from the government yet on this. But if you haven't seen that article, please take a look at it. And if you are a national of one of those 43 countries, that may enter into your calculus as to whether or not to travel internationally. Even with permission to enter advanced parole, to enter or to exit and come back in, you may have a more difficult time when you try to re-enter based on these travel bans. Another big piece of this, which has again been in the news, are your policy considerations around your right to protest. We have been seeing more and more politically motivated immigration actions taken against non-citizen activists in the last week and a half. So Mahmoud Khalil in New York City, Jeanette Becerra in Colorado, both very high profile activists in their various areas, have been detained by ICE. And we continue to see stories of folks who are either being detained or denied entry to the United States based on their political affiliations. So that is something to keep in mind. However, everyone has a constitutionally guaranteed right to free speech and lawful assembly, regardless of your status. Everyone has the right. That's enshrined within our Constitution, which still means something. Just because the targeting is happening does not mean that you don't have the right to continue to do that. We do have a resource on 10 things non-citizen protesters need to know. It's going to be on the resource slide at the end of this webinar. So please take a look at that. But some just sort of evergreen top line advice for if you're going to protest as a non-citizen, always be prepared and make sure you know your rights. Make sure somebody knows where you're going and that you're going to a protest. Down important phone numbers, a friend, a family member, an attorney if you have one, a rapid response network, a detention hotline, whatever you got, write that down, and don't take your phone with you. And always, 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 if you're arrested, remain silent and say you want to speak to a lawyer. And then I just wanted to talk a little bit about legislation. We are seeing a lot of anti-immigrant legislation coming up on the federal level in Congress. We're seeing some better legislation in some states, but on the federal side, if you were with us last time, we talked a little bit about the Lake and Riley Act, which was signed into law in January, which expands the categories of those subject to mandatory detention. Again, mandatory detention is exactly what it sounds like. It is detention without the possibility of bond. Um, so the Lake and Riley Act expanded of those who would be subject to mandatory detention, including those who have been arrested, charged, or convicted of theft offenses, and also assault on a law enforcement officer. We're still waiting to see how this is going to be implemented and how it could be used against specific populations, including DACA holders. But again, this is part of the increased enforcement that we've been seeing, and just another piece of the puzzle of the sort of high intensity immigration enforcement that we've been seeing. Another piece of that is we're seeing more money being appropriated by Congress for the mass deportation agenda. Just recently, they passed a longer continuing resolution that takes us to the end of the year to provide more resources for immigration enforcement. They were able to do that despite not being able to put together an actual budget for the country, which is one of the main things they're supposed to do every year, and they just haven't done it. But they did find it. They did find a way to ensure that more money went to immigration enforcement. And we're always saying that the government doesn't have enough resources to do the things that they say they want to do regarding mass deportation, but they're definitely trying to bridge that gap. And then there's some other anti-immigrant bills on the horizon that have gotten some attention within Congress, haven't necessarily come up for a vote yet, but could come up for a vote. One in particular would make any DUI, anyone who's not a U.S. citizen who has one DUI, inadmissible and subject to deportation. So that's something that's upcoming. So please pay attention to the congressional landscape. Please call your representatives. Please pay attention to your state legislation too, and call your representatives as well. We need to hear from you. A lot of them are particularly susceptible to pressure, so let's keep it up. And then just wrapping up before I turn it over to Vero. So ultimately, this particular court decision comes at a really perilous time for DACA holders. Again, the current administration has not made any secret of their general animosity towards immigrant communities. So this is a dangerous time to be in a not so stable status. Whenever you are considering what moves you're going to take, whether you're going to renew your DACA or apply for an initial DACA, if you're going to register or not register, you're going to make yourself known to immigration authorities, even if you haven't before. You really need to consider the full landscape of immigration law and the mentality of this administration and the kind of higher risk of enforcement that we're seeing. They have stated their commitment over and over again to deporting as many people as they can, and that manifests in a lot of different ways. So just make sure you're keeping up with the news as best you can without going crazy, and keeping in mind that the risk of enforcement is much higher than it maybe once was. And always, always, always know your rights and seek a legal consultation. Even if you were screened a year ago, get it screened again. We're in a new landscape. It's changing constantly. So just continue to keep in touch with an attorney if you have one, and seek a legal consultation before you decide to do anything. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Vero.
Thank you, Liz. And I know there's a lot of, there are more questions than answers, and I'm about to go through a lot more questions that we don't have answers to, as a way to hopefully guide how we could prepare, how you all could prepare as we wait for more guidance or more action from the different parties in this lawsuit. As Liz mentioned, this has been a long and winding road. There has always been a bit of confusion as to who could access DACA, when can you access DACA, whether you should even access DACA, right? As the landscape changes and we see a lot more anti-immigrant policies come up, and a lot more questions around who has rights for what, regardless of the status that they hold, right? So definitely a confusing time. So please bear with us as we go through a lot more questions that you should consider as you're thinking about requesting DACA. And, these questions pertain more to individuals who have never accessed DACA, right? So people who might have been eligible but didn't get the opportunity to file an initial DACA when it was open for that very short period of time back in 2021, or people who maybe let their DACA lapse and are now thinking whether they should come forward and renew again. So to get us started, right, there's a lot of questions about whether people should prepare to file an initial DACA now. So as Liz mentioned, right, the litigation is confusing, right? And now with this final decision from the Fifth Circuit, right, that seems to have gone into effect, there is, this ability for initial DACAs to continue or be actually processed, right? So the stay in the injunction that was originally issued back in 2021, right, and then with the implementation partially of the DACA rule, there was always the ability for DACA recipients to come forward and file, or for potential DACA recipients to come forward and file a DACA initial. They were just not being processed because of the litigation, right? So the litigation stated that USCIS could not, at the moment, issue any grants or any decisions on DACA, right? So people who had filed and were not approved as of that date back in 2021, right, they are stuck in the pipeline. And there were a few people who did come forward and submit a DACA initial because they had spoken to someone and they thought that maybe waiting or being in the pipeline was better than not, right? So we do have those cases that are pending before USCIS. Now with this latest court decision, right, DACA initials are technically open and people should be able to continue to file those initials. The thing that changes, or that could potentially change, is that USCIS now is able to grant or deny those decisions, right? So give you a decision on the case, right? Let you know whether you will have DACA or not have DACA. With that said, right, we don't know exactly how the administration is going to implement this decision or how they're going to acknowledge this decision, right? As Liz mentioned, as of today, we haven't seen any new guidance from USCIS. The last time they acknowledged a court decision was on January 17th, right, when we got the first initial decision from the Fifth Circuit, right? So they haven't acknowledged that this decision essentially went into effect, right? So when we're thinking about whether we should come forward, right, or whether we should prepare to file an initial now, there are a lot of unknowns that need to be taken into consideration as you're having that discussion with the legal service provider, right, or a DOJ, either a DOJ accredited rep or an attorney to help you navigate this space, right? So I think one of the biggest questions is, will the administration process initial DACAs, right? Up to now, we haven't seen them acknowledge this court decision, right? We haven't seen any guidance given from this court decision. So we don't know how they're going to treat initial DACAs, right? And we do have that set of applications that were submitted, right, that were stuck because of the injunction, right, from the Texas court. And we're waiting to see how those will be managed, right? There were a lot of questions in the chat whether people would need to submit a new application. Based on what we know, it doesn't seem like they would need to file a new I-821D, right? So the DACA application, but there is a possibility that the administration will ask for more information if they decide to process these, like maybe fingerprinting again, or possibly a request for more evidence, right? Because it's been a few years, they might want you to prove that you still live in the United States, right? So up to now, right, whether they were processed them or not, we don't know. I think the best case scenario, as we'll talk in a bit, is to wait and see if they require more information, to wait and see how those are processed, right? As you're thinking about preparing to file, it might be good to wait and see what happens with those, right? Because then you will know whether the administration is acknowledging them or not. The other thing to consider as we're thinking about whether we should prepare to file an initial or not is thinking about how the administration will use the information collected, right? So Liz just went through some of the changes in policy, right? And how the administration has ramped up enforcement, right? And has ramped up a lot of agencies, to be enforcement arms in, their ultimate goal or their ultimate desire, right, to do a lot more deportations, right? So it's something to think about as you're gathering or thinking about filing, right, is how will this information be used, right? And maybe it's another opportunity to wait and see what happens with those initials that are pending, right? And to see what information is being requested before anybody moves forward, right? And also to understand what information is being requested of individuals, right, for them to come forward and apply for an initial DACA, right? With that said, also thinking about like whose information will need to be added, right, might be another consideration, another discussion to have with your legal service provider. Another thing to consider if we start seeing some of these cases move is trying to get an understanding of which cases are being granted or which cases are being denied, right? So DACA, while it has its requirements that you need to meet in order to be eligible for this type of deferred action, right, it's also discretionary, right? So there are things that USCIS could say can make someone ineligible for DACA, right? Or there's certain contacts with law enforcement that doesn't bar you completely from applying to DACA, right? But the administration could take and say, well, based on this, we don't think that you merit a grant of DACA. So definitely thinking about, which cases will be granted or which ones will be denied as you're thinking or preparing to file an initial DACA, right? And move forward, doing that risk assessment, thinking about what's in your case or what could impact your case that might not bar you, right? But could get someone denied. And then the other thing is thinking through the risks of whether if you are denied DACA, right, will you get a notice to appear before immigration court, right, and how that would look. And also identifying with your legal service provider how, what other benefits outside of DACA you might be eligible for if you do end up in removal proceedings, right? So there are a lot of unknowns. We don't know, a lot of questions that need to be answered, but it's definitely, an opportunity to have that discussion, talk to someone, and kind of think through some of the things that will be asked of you, and then what are the risks of you coming forward and giving your information to immigration, right? And this analysis would change depending on how much contact someone has had with immigration, right? So there are definitely a set of DACA recipients who would be considered initials and were not able to get granted because they had let their DACA lapse for more than a year. Right? Those individuals, their information is already with USCIS, right? So this discussion that they have with their legal service provider, right, around whether the administration will even process initials, right, or whether, what information will be collected or what happens if you get denied, that conversation will be slightly different because immigration already has some of this information, right? So depending on the risk, right, depending on your facts, that could guide your conversation as you're thinking about whether you should prepare to file. Also, definitely if you've had contact with immigration or have some sort of removal case, right, or you're in immigration court, then that conversation would also change, right? Because the information that they will collect or the information they have already of you is different, right? And you definitely want to be able to access a benefit if you can, right? So just things to keep in mind, right, as you're thinking about whether you should prepare to file or not, and what's happening politically, right, in the immigration space. I think for everyone, the best case scenario or the best possible thing that we could do at this moment is to wait and see. I know that that's not a satisfactory answer, right, to wait and see whether you should come forward or not, or whether you should start prepping or not to file an initial DACA. I think it's important to wait and see because we have more unknowns than knowns, and how rapidly the immigration landscape is changing, right? the policies being announced, right? We want to make sure that when we come forward, we understand both the risks and the benefits, and that we've had, we have the best information possible to make the best decision for yourself, right? Because nobody can make this decision for you. You have to make that decision for yourself and what's best for you in your case. And the reason that a lot of advocates are telling individuals to wait and see is because it would be good to see whether they start or even process DACA initials, right? So, wait to see if those that were filed in July of 2021 before the injunction, whether those get any movement, right? Also to see if any of those are granted or are asked for more information, right? So like I mentioned, it's possible that they will ask for those cases to get fingerprinted again. It's possible they'll ask for more evidence of those cases, right? And then also waiting and see will allow us to see what guidance the government issues, right? And whether they'll even acknowledge that this case happened, right? It'll also allow us to see whether it's appealed to the Supreme Court or not, right? Like Liz mentioned, that date has not passed. So it's important to see, right, will it be appealed, and how does that appeal impact the Fifth Circuit decision, right? Does it put a hold on all of it again, or does it just appeal what's happening in Texas, right? And also it'd be important to see how Texas is handling, right, the process of separating the work permit from the protection from deportation. A process does have to be issued by that judge, right? Right now that is stayed, and people in Texas who have DACA could continue to renew, right, and continue to access DACA. Even if this decision is implemented, right, where there's a separation from the work permit and the protection from deportation, DACA recipients in Texas will still be able to apply for DACA, right, and get that protection from deportation, right? But there's a lot of things to wait and see, right? So just to recap, right, I see that there's a lot of confusion about whether DACA initials are being accepted or not. The simple answer is yes, right? DACA initials have been accepted, right? They have, USCIS recognized that they would continue to accept them even since July of 2021. The thing that was stopped was that USCIS was not able to grant any of those DACA because of the pending litigation, right? So they weren't able to give you a final decision. What this newest decision gives us is that it allows or tells USCIS that, while they don't agree that DACA is lawful, right, they were limiting their decision to the state of Texas. And in Texas, they were separating the benefit of protection from deportation, which the government could do, from the work permit, right? So right now, how we are in this, what we're waiting for is to see whether the administration will acknowledge this and give us guidance, and whether that gets appealed or not, right? So that's why there's all these questions about, when should you come forward, whether you should wait and see, whether it's even beneficial to apply for DACA for the first time, right? And as of today, right, March 20th, DACA remains available for everyone who's had DACA up to now, right? So DACA renewals, people could renew, could get a work permit, could get protection from deportation regardless of where they live, but things will change in the coming months. So it's important to stay informed, right? And one of the biggest pieces we're waiting for is to see how the administration and USCIS, right, will treat this latest development, right? Whether they'll acknowledge that the Fifth Circuit decision went into effect, right? And whether they'll start processing those initial DACAs that are in the pipeline. And then based on that, I think individuals could take that information and then have that conversation with a legal service provider, right? Either an attorney or a DOJ or accredited rep. So you could think through some of the risks and benefits of applying. So if you are interested in filing an initial DACA, this means that you have never submitted an application to the government, right? And that you're not one of those cases that's stuck in the pipeline from this litigation, but you have heard that maybe they'll start accepting and processing new DACAs. The best thing you could do is get an immigration screening. right? So go talk to an attorney, talk to them about the facts in your case, right? The history of when you came in, whether you had any encounters with immigration, whether you have ever been in court, whether you have ever traveled, right? Even after you entered, have that conversation with them, right? Because it's important for them to know all the facts of your particular case so that then they could help you assess what risks or benefits there will be of you coming forward, right? There is a lot of things moving, right? A lot of different policy announcements that could negatively impact people who are attempting to obtain a benefit, right? So get that immigration screening. With that, walk through a risk assessment with the person who knows your case so that they could see what's in your case and whether it's, best to go forward and apply for DACA or whether it's best to wait a little more and see what happens, right? And also with that immigration screening, right, it would also allow you to see whether you're eligible for something beyond DACA, right? Because DACA, it's a great benefit, but it's only temporary, and it's important to see if you're eligible for something more permanent. Also, through this risk assessment, it would be good to have a discussion and understand the information that the government will collect from you, right? That will go into deciding whether you decide to file an initial DACA or not. Because some of these forms, right, do require a lot of information, right? Maybe coming forward for an immigration benefit might require someone to register who hasn't registered before. So important to have that conversation with your legal service provider. And then definitely, like I mentioned, stay informed, right? Things will develop. We will hopefully hear soon, what can happen next, either getting some guidance from USCIS or hearing from Judge Hannon, who is the Texas judge, how they will treat the Texas decision or the decision that impacts Texas, right? Or whether it's going to be appealed to the Supreme Court, right? So it's important to stay informed. Things will be changing in the coming months, right? Or weeks. And it's important to have all those developments as you're making that decision as to file or not file. For those who are DACA renewals, the analysis is a bit different, right? You already have DACA, you're eligible to renew your DACA. The analysis would be to continue to renew your DACA, right? If nothing has changed in your case, right, you are still, information's the same, right? You haven't had any new contact with law enforcement. You are eligible to access, it's important to, come forward and renew your DACA. When you renew, right, if your DACA is expiring within the next 6 months, we generally tell people to renew as soon as possible, right, to make sure that if there is any delays in the review of your application, that you get it in time before your current DACA period expires. For those whose DACA expires 6 months to the year, you could consider renewing if you have the funds to do it. It's fine for you to do it. USCIS is processing those DACAs, even if you file early. And if you want to feel, a bit more secure, right, and get a little more time, it's, you could definitely file now. Just note that you will be granted DACA. Your new period will be from the day you are granted DACA. So that might cut a few months from your new DACA period. So you might not get the full 2 years. That's why we generally tell people that you should consider renewing, but maybe 6 months to a year, not more than a year, because then you lose too much time and it might not be worth it at that point. The other thing is, even if you have DACA right now, it's important to also explore your other legal options beyond DACA, right? There's a lot of uncertainty in DACA still. There's a possibility that the administration might try to end DACA a different way, right? So it's important to explore what other options you might have and speak to a legal service provider and get that consultation, and then definitely stay informed, right? More things will change in DACA in the coming weeks. We will hear more announcements, right? More movement. So it's important to stay informed. And just to reiterate, DACA recipients, regardless of where they live, for DACA renewals, you're still eligible to renew your DACA and get a work permit and protection from deportation, right? So that currently stays the same. Everybody's able to, who is going to renew their DACA, to get a work permit and protection from deportation. Some consideration for DACA renewals. Like I noted, it's important to ensure that you renew in a timely manner, right? So don't let your DACA lapse. Go in, renew that, make sure that you do that in a timely fashion. Consider renewing online. Probably many of you are already doing that, right? But if you haven't considered doing filing online, you save some money, right? So it's cheaper to do it online. And also you get a receipt notice immediately. And we're hearing from some practitioners that people are getting approved a bit faster, right? If they file online versus a paper, but definitely consider doing that. Also, I know a lot of DACA recipients have been filing their DACAs for a very long time, so feel comfortable doing it alone. At this moment, because of how the landscape is, it might be good to connect with a legal service provider, even if you have been renewing your DACA on your own, just to get that check, right? Because things are changing. Unfortunately, we're seeing a lot more vetting, right, of applications. So you want to make sure that everything is good on your case, or if there's anything on your, in your case that you might want to just keep an eye on, right, that you get that legal analysis and that risk assessment as you explore your options and as you continue to renew your DACA. So definitely, can make that connection. I know there's some resources on campus, right, for individuals to go and, get that connection so that they could get screened with a legal service provider, right? And then just before I jump into advanced parole a bit, just to reiterate, right? So DACA recipients who are considered renewals, right? That would be anyone who has DACA currently or had DACA, but it has not been expired for more than a year. Those are considered DACA renewals. Those could come forward, right? They could apply and they could receive a decision from USCIS. People who have never been granted DACA, or people whose DACA expired for more than a year, right? So a year and 1 day, those will be considered DACA initials. And those are the ones right now that we don't know exactly how they will be treated per this last court decision, right? So definitely wait and see and get more information on all that. So for advanced parole, like Liz mentioned, advanced parole continues, right? If you're a DACA recipient and you currently have DACA and are interested in seeing if you could travel, it's definitely something that's still being approved from what we hear, and people are still being able to travel and enter without issue. People who have DACA are able to request DACA either for an employment purpose, a humanitarian purpose, or an education purpose. Because of how the political landscape is, we are recommending that people get a risk assessment, talk with the legal service provider, and just consider how the different policies that have been announced and different changes that we have seen could impact your individual travel. And to make sure you make that connection with a legal service provider before you apply, have them help you while you're applying, and also connect with them before you leave the United States, even if you have been approved for advanced parole. Things to consider for travel, right? So do not apply for advanced parole on your own. If you can, consider applying via emergency advanced parole, right? That's the one where you go into the USCIS office, right? You do an appointment and they give you a decision relatively quickly. We used to see them, same day. Now it's taken a few days, right? But the reason we say consider applying via emergency advanced parole, if you can, it's because you get that decision a lot sooner and you're able to travel before more things change, right? Things are changing rapidly, right? So if you could do that, definitely try. Emergency advanced parole is usually given for people who have an emergency, right? Like a relative that is very sick and you need to exit quickly to go see them, right? Is an example of it. So definitely explore that. Also discuss, the country you are traveling to, right? We had some information that travel bans could be coming, how that will impact people traveling at advanced parole. We will wait and see how those travel bans look, but definitely discuss what country you're going to and what particular requirements that country might have. And then consult with an expert, right, as you're working through your advanced parole application, especially, right, if you have been deported or order removed in the past. This shouldn't prevent you from accessing advanced parole, but things are, we want to make sure that you are able to handle and answer any questions that you might get at the border, right? So if you've ever been deported or removed before, talk to someone, see how that could impact you in the future, whether it's best maybe to not travel right now because of that. Definitely, if you've had contact with ICE or Border Patrol when you entered the United States, definitely talk about that. Or if you had any arrests or convictions, right? So we want to make sure that if they fingerprint you or when they fingerprint you, if anything comes up, it won't harm or put you at risk of not being able to re-enter. We haven't heard that happening, right? But it's better to be overly cautious so that you're ready when you come into the United States, right? Advanced parole allows you to travel, right? But it doesn't guarantee an entry into the United States. The Border Patrol official will still make that determination. We're hearing a lot of DACA recipients are being sent to secondary inspection. So we want to make sure that you're able to have that conversation, have all your documents ready to go when that happens. And then, even if your AP has been approved, we recommend that you check in with an attorney before you travel and discuss how re-entering, would be, what things you should carry, how you should answer questions, have an attorney's number that you could call in case, there's any issues at the border, and review any changes in policy or activity at the airport where you're flying into, just so that you're ready, right? So even if you have it approved, please have that conversation to make sure that there wasn't any policy change that would impact your travel. And then, keep in mind when you're returning where you are flying into. Some airports we have heard are friendlier than others, right? So where you will go through customs is the first airport you fly into. So if you have a layover in Texas, that will be the airport you will go through customs. If you have a layover in San Diego, that will be the airport you go through customs. So, be mindful of where you're flying into and how people are being treated at the airport. And like I mentioned, be prepared to be sent to secondary inspection, right? And the officers may ask more questions about your travel, what you did. They may attempt to search your belongings. So really important to have your phone, maybe in another place kind of thing, as you're going through that. And then figure out what's on your social media accounts, because that all might be searched at the airport. And then just lastly, to end, before we do a few questions, just some general reminders. Remember, a lot of things are changing. We are hearing a lot more people being, in these situations where they are being detained and things are scarier and more uncertain, right? But we still have, rights given to us by the Constitution, and we need to exercise those rights. So if you are questioned, if you are, out and about and ICE attempts to stop you, remember that you have a right to remain silent. You have a right to the legal process and to refuse to sign any documents or produce any documents that you might have, and protect yourselves from unlawful searches, right? So I know this is all dependent on where you are at the moment, but generally everybody has these rights and we should exercise them regardless of what your immigration status is. And then, regardless of what your current status is, right? If you are an LPR or a green card holder, a DACA recipient, have TPS, or are thinking about what you might be eligible for, it's always good to get that legal consultation to see if you would be eligible for more permanent relief in the United States. Talk to someone that's trusted and discuss what you are eligible for, what your family might be eligible for, and also to help you do these risk assessment, right? It's going to, as things change, it's harder to give general advice, right? It's going to depend a lot on your own case, what you're applying for, what has happened in your history. So it's important to have that one-on-one discussion with someone about your case and not go off of what you hear happened to a friend or happened to someone that someone knows. It's better to have that discussion for yourself and get your questions answered. And then, you know, it's always good to be prepared. So if possible, help create a preparedness plan in case something changes or something happens, right? And one of you or someone in the family isn't able to be there, right? What they would like to happen with their family in their absence, right? So it's a way to help organize any documents or any action plans that you might want to have. And then also put together any important contact information and documents for uh, anybody who might be helping with their case in the future. And then lastly, we have here a long list of resources that we could share with you. Definitely come and see our ILRC DACA toolbox. We will provide updates as things change and as we know what's happening with initials. So please come, you know, check us out. We have resources also. You know, there's resources for rapid response in California in case there's any ICE encounters. Also, what you could do if you are a non-citizen protester, and then other toolkits around Know Your Rights. So definitely stay informed. It's very important at this time to stay as informed as possible and make sure that you're getting your sources or your information from trusted individuals and organizations. So with that, I will leave it there and see if there's any questions we would want to answer out loud.
So I've been going through and collecting some, and I'll give Vero a little bit of a break to look through. So I'm seeing a couple of trends and questions. One is, one question is why shouldn't you take your phone to a protest? And I think that um, if you do take your phone to a protest, you want to make sure that like your Face ID or fingerprint unlock is disabled. The short answer to that is if you are arrested at a protest, whether you're a citizen or not a non-citizen, if you are arrested at a protest, the police could go through your phone and look for reasons to detain you for longer. We are starting to see this um, in some of the stories that we're seeing of immigration enforcement against non-citizens who have taken part in have taken pro-Palestine or free Palestine stances, that folks are being accused of Hamas sympathies based on information that's in their phones. And so I think that's a trend that we can expect to continue. So that's why you wouldn't take your phone to a protest, or you would make sure that any of the automatic unlocking mechanisms are disabled if you are going to take your phone. I'm also seeing a question about is there a list of friendly airports? And I am not aware of a list of friendly airports. Vero, I don't know if you are or not. I think at this point, we're basically looking at airports that are not making news in terms of a really heavy duty enforcement screening. So Boston, Logan Airport in Boston has made the news several times. Over the last week or so of denying folks entry for different reasons. So I think if there is a list that friendly airports, Boston is probably not on that list. But I don't know if anyone is collecting, an airport where the screening is a little bit less intense. I see here is TSA working with ICE. I think one of the other pieces in the mass deportation scheme is that all of the government agencies are now working together in immigration enforcement. Several weeks, well, I don't know if it was several weeks ago, but since the inauguration, we've had a lot of information. We've had a lot of declarations, a lot of memorandums of understanding that have come out between different agencies, federal agencies like the IRS and the FBI and other law enforcement type agencies agreeing to work as immigration enforcement as well. So, I don't know if there's any sort of formal agreement, but I think that for now, until we have more information or certainly more, we've been doing this for longer. I think it's safe to assume that there's a lot of information sharing going on between federal agencies, but particularly within the Department of Homeland Security. And that is federal agencies and some state agencies. But I don't know if you have found any questions or buckets of questions to answer.
Would you be able to just direct our guests and participants today into where they can find information on applying for DACA for the first time? I saw a couple of those questions.
Sure. And Vito, jump in. I always direct people to the Immigrants Rising website. They've got a pretty good website, which I can try to put in the chat for folks about applying for DACA for the first time. I will find that.
Yeah, there's some resources on our DACA ILRC page, but they might be buried for now because it's been a while, right, since people are able to apply for the first time. But they're definitely there. And then I think as we move forward and we wait, we will see organizations come up with more resources on that. So please stay tuned for that. But definitely Immigrants Rising. Definitely there's some on our DACA page, but you might have to search a bit for it to get information on that.
Also seeing some questions about who filed for DACA, didn't get an answer. At least one that's been waiting since July of 2021. I think that, that's one of the cases that got kind of caught up in this like litigation maze that we're in, where the initials were open and then litigation stopped the initials. And so they've all just been sort of held at USCIS waiting for litigation to resolve, which we're assuming, I mean, I don't know if we're assuming anything because we don't really have any information, but, based on the Fifth Circuit's decision, the initials are permitted to go forward, but it's a matter of whether or not the agency is determining whether or not they can go forward. And again, we don't have any information about that. So I would say anything that was applied for as any initials that folks filed in 2021 are still in that bucket of delayed. I don't even know if delayed is the word right now. It's just, sort of just sitting in purgatory at USCIS until somebody gives some guidance of what to do.
Yeah, and connected to that, there was a lot of questions about whether people will need to refile an application. I guess the best answer now is we don't know, but we don't think so, right? Usually they should be able to take that information and make a decision. Like we mentioned, they might ask for more information from you, right? So either more evidence that you have been here or ask you to be fingerprinted again, but filing the application from scratch, we don't think that would be the move. But once again, we have to wait and see what guidance the administration gives, right, for those cases.
I'm also seeing some questions about domestic travel. And Vero, I don't know if you can answer those. I mean, obviously domestic travel doesn't come with the same issues as international travel. But I don't know if we've seen any guidance on domestic travel this far.
Yeah, so there is some guidance and information on domestic travel on the Immigrants Rising website. They also have done a lot of information on that. So if you want to go and take a look there, generally, we haven't heard that DACA recipients are not able to travel domestically, right? And historically, people have been able to travel domestically as a DACA recipient. Usually when they travel, right, if a DACA recipient has their state ID right before the implementation of the real ID, you could use that state ID to travel domestically and show that as your identification, right, when you go through airport security. Once the Real ID comes into effect, right, if you're able to access the Real ID, then you could still use the Real ID to travel domestically, right, as a DACA recipient. And I know that as a DACA recipient, if you're able to access an ID in your state, you're able to access the Real ID, right, or driver's license, right, from your state. So you should be able to get that. They're usually given for the 2-year period, right, that you have DACA versus the longer period that you get it, from the state, but you should be able to use that and travel. And yes, DACA recipients could access the Real ID. It should be possible to do that. So if you're able to do that, get that, and then you could use that to travel. We go over this in the KYR line when we talk about like what documents to show and not show. And it's definitely always better to show a document that doesn't have your place of birth, right? So if you're able to use an ID, definitely do that instead of your work permit.
I'm seeing some questions and some notes about notarios. And I see a question as well about assistance for families that hired an attorney that was not licensed, and any assistance with fraud. And each state has a mechanism to report fraud. So it depends on where you are, but each state does have a mechanism to report a fraud through the state bar. I think it's something that, we haven't been mentioning, but we probably should mention more on these types of presentations and briefings and whatnot, is that the chaos and the kind of current uneasiness that's being fomented makes the situation very ripe for notario fraud and for folks taking advantage of folks who are nervous about what's coming and what's happening. So that's why things like Find Your Ally are so important, to get a legal screening from an attorney or an accredited representative or someone who is licensed to do this work. We've, as soon as registration was announced, we started hearing folks being charged to register, which is not a thing that should be happening. And this as well, when we have something that's a big shift like this court case with DACA, the misinformation can run really rampant, and it can create a really fertile ground for fraud and for folks looking to take advantage of other folks and saying, oh, initial DACAs are open, let's file as soon as we can. And even help that's well-meaning in that sphere could open a person up to immigration enforcement. So again, I know we're a broken record on this, but if you have the ability to get a legal consultation and get screened by an attorney or a licensed representative, then then we should be able to, then you should do that immediately. I'm also seeing some questions about the reintroduction of the Dream and Promise Act. It was reintroduced, I believe. If it hasn't been reintroduced yet, it will be reintroduced. The likelihood of it getting a vote in this Congress is low, but the point of continuing to reintroduce these bills that would expand relief for folks, I think, really does make it so that the more it's introduced, the more it sort of lives in the minds of the public and the representatives. And so the better the chances that, there can be some movement on it if and when we hopefully get a friendlier political climate. But yeah, so it has been reintroduced. It'll keep getting reintroduced, etc.
Yeah, and then I know there's a lot of questions about travel, and like Liz mentioned, we sound like a broken record, but the best thing that you could do if you're interested in traveling, whether it's domestically or internationally, and just speaking domestically, if you don't have lawful status right now, would be to speak to someone before you travel. We haven't heard of things happening domestically at airports, right? But just because of how uncertain things are, it's really good to have that to have that point of contact with an attorney right before you before you travel, sorry, especially if you are going to use a foreign passport because you cannot access a state ID or the real ID. Have that conversation. And then also for all those who are thinking of filing an initial DACA or have a DACA that's stuck in the pipeline, like we mentioned, right, have that conversation with an attorney. It's important to wait and see how these moving pieces land before coming forward and submitting anything. And we don't know what will happen in the future or what strategy might be used if USCIS does not recognize this decision. So definitely important to wait and see what happens in that scenario. So I will leave it there.
Cynthia, how are we doing on time? I don't know if we're over time or.
No worries. I just want to be mindful of time. So with that, thank you, Liz and Veronica, for sharing this wonderful presentation. We'll be sure to share out the recording and the presentation with you all shortly, either this week or early next week. And then with that, we can go ahead and close that out. Thank you all for joining today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.